All right, we'll give it just another minute or so as people are gathering. Hi, everyone. We are very excited to have you join us here today for our virtual panel event. And we'll be spending the next hour talking about patient apps and their evolving role in the healthcare landscape. I'm Jen Sato. I'm a Health Tech Build board member. And before we start, I did want to take just a minute to highlight what Health Tech Build is about. We are a mission-driven nonprofit. We're focused on accelerating digital technology within healthcare and life sciences. And we look to create opportunities for collaboration between sectors, for example, with events like this one. A very important part of what we do is sponsorships. If you think you may be interested in partnering with us, whether as a sponsor or participating in one of our events, we would love to hear from you. You can contact us directly on our website, healthtechbuild.com. We've had a number of events and have been very fortunate to have a number of leading organizations participate. And we have a great lineup of speakers today. I wanted to thank them for joining us. John Stryker of Mayo Clinic, Deepu Patel of Day to Day Health, Erez Kaminsky of Catrix, Thom Busby of Outcome Capital, and Thom will be moderating today. I also wanted to extend a special thank you to MediCuity, our sponsor. If you have questions during the session, please use the chat function. We will get to as many of them as possible. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Thom.
Thank you so much, Jen. And we welcome all of our audience members here today. We're excited about today's topic. I want to once again thank Jen as our Health Tech Build President, Jared McLean also for the technical support for today's panel event. And again, we want to thank MediCuity and Dean Andrews specifically for sponsoring today's event and their commitment to Health Tech Build. Be sure to seek out MediCuity for all of your MedTech software needs, from strategic consulting, software development, to ongoing software validation. And for those of you new to Health Tech Build, we are, as Jen said, a Boston-based digital health trade group, bringing together thought leaders, entrepreneurs, operators, and investors to discuss the biggest issues facing the digital health industry today. My name is Thom Busby. I'm a board member of Health Tech Build. I'm delighted to be today's moderator. Professionally, I'm a vice president with Outcome Capital. We're a highly specialized technology, life sciences, and healthcare investment banking group dedicated to delivering strategic advisory services to our clients. With me today, we have a fantastic panel of individuals spanning the digital health continuum, from clinicians and healthcare providers to software developers and entrepreneurs. If we could take a moment and have everyone introduce themselves, that would be great. And as Jen mentioned, if there's any questions from the audience, please do put them in the chat. We look forward to getting to as many of those as we can. Without any further ado, Deepu, if you could maybe take a moment, introduce yourself and a little bit of your background, that would be fantastic.
Sure, thanks, Thom. And thank you everyone for having me and inviting me to the panel. I'm Deepu Patel. I'm a physician assistant. I've been a PA for about 21 years. My clinical background is in emergency medicine, urgent care, and hematology oncology. Prior to my current role as Director of Clinical Pathways at Day to Day, I was a professor at Northeastern's Physician Assistant Program, where I spearheaded a number of innovations and innovative programs, including their simulation program. In my current role, I sit at the I guess corner or at the Venn diagram, if you will, of research, sales, product, and content. And we deliver. We're in the surgical space, and so we deliver various surgical verticals and procedure plans in the current role. Thanks.
John, if you could do the same.
Sure. I'm John Stricker, and I am currently an application architect in the neurology AI program at the Mayo Clinic. This is an interdisciplinary team working to build software and data collection applications that will also use AI for the benefit of physicians, providers, and patients. Prior to that, I have a PhD in clinical psychology. I was an attending psychologist at the University of New Mexico Hospital. After that, I took a software development role at a company called Raise Labs in Boston, which was acquired by Rightpoint and then Genpact. Worked my way up to a technical lead on teams for them prior to coming to work for the Mayo Clinic.
And Erez, if you could do the same, please.
Absolutely, thank you, Thom. So my name is Erez Kaminsky. I'm the founder and CEO of Ketrex, a company developing software development tools for healthcare and life science. Prior to Ketrex, I worked at companies like Amgen and Wolfram Research, developing also development tools, and then slowly into the regulated space of healthcare and life science. And I did my graduate studies at MIT's Computer Science Department.
Thank you, everyone. So, I think one of the first things that we want to turn our attention to is on the reimbursement side of digital health and patient apps. And maybe Deepu, if you could elaborate a little bit on how healthcare is adopting remote patient monitoring. And then just recently, too, I think we had therapeutic patient monitoring codes be discussed. What's been your experience there, and what can you share with the crowd today?
Yeah, so I do think as awful as COVID has been over the past year and a half or so, I do think the floodgates have opened and allowed for this ecosystem to evolve at a much rapid pace than it had previously. And a lot of that has to do with reimbursement of these services that we've had the technology to provide for a number of years, but the reimbursement rates and the reimbursement policies and regulations have not followed suit. And therefore, organizations previously who were nervous about tackling this systemic issue around reimbursement and remote patient monitoring were not willing to invest the time or the resources to do so. And I think COVID has allowed us to do that and evolve that ecosystem at a faster pace. So in that, I will talk about CMS, and I know Erez has a particular interest in the regulatory landscape, so I'll hand it off to him. But remote patient monitoring CPT codes were released late last year and approved by CMS. And more recently, they've actually broken down remote patient monitoring and now are adding additional codes around remote therapeutic monitoring. There's some overlap among both of those. And the key difference is remote patient monitoring applies to physiologic data collection, whereas remote therapeutic monitoring is non-physiologic data collection, more around things like environmental data, social data, and medication adherence and things like that. And so a couple of differences are how the data is collected, what data is collected, and what clinicians are able to actually bill for the remote therapeutic services. We're at the beginning of this conversation, and I'm really happy to see that CMS is actually in line. We're not 5 years behind, so to speak, with these regulations, but there is a lot of vagueness in the regs still. And I'm very curious to see how this evolves.
Yeah, and maybe I can add to that, Deepu, that just as, it seems like the CMS is restructuring how you get paid for these type of digital services. At the same time, the FDA and other bodies are reviewing better ways to approve them, notify the FDA of new products and processes, and actually build these things from the ground up in a way that's substantially more cost effective. We're seeing that that's generating a lot of interest in the market and a lot of prospective customers trying to think, how do I make my app or my software into a medical device or a digital therapeutic? And at the same time, we're seeing the FDA coming out, hopefully this year, with a new set of regulations more attuned to the kind of modern infrastructure of software development for the first time in 20 years. So I think that all those together are coming together at a very exciting time in digital health.
And then maybe Deepu and Erez and John, feel free to chime in too. In your view, has the market adopted these RPM technologies the way that we would expect? I know that COVID has created some interesting tailwinds, but as we kind of bring ourselves up to 40,000 feet, do we see RPM being adopted by the clinical community in a way that we would hope them to?
I can start, and Perez and John, please. I think there is definite openness from the clinical community for this because it does alleviate the clinician's burden in terms of the physical face-to-face contact. Although there is importance around that interaction and that relationship, I do think we're going to have more touch points with the patient. In the clinical realm, we always talk about making sure that that physician-patient or provider-patient relationship is good so that you can actually improve the outcomes for a patient. But there's going to be a shift from these interventional one-time-a-year visits to more, more regular monitoring visits where you'll have multiple touch points with a patient so that there truly is this guiding process around a particular patient's issues, whatever they may be. And I think remote patient monitoring is certainly going to help that in many, many ways. From a consumer point of view, I think it's there. I mean, I think we're all attached to our phones now. This, entering a blood pressure or uploading how many steps we're walking or is becoming less and less of a burden as these apps continue to improve. It's a matter of also validating the data. And I think that's coming, and it's coming actually at a pretty rapid pace.
Moving on, it's been an interesting experience, I think, for technologists trying to get into digital health, that they realize that the capital requirements to develop these digital health applications are far in excess of what other technology companies require. I think that there's been an appreciation on the clinical community that this is a capital-intensive venture. But perhaps, Erez, if maybe you could unpack why is it the case that regulated software is so capital-intensive, and what are those capital requirements continue on? Is it just a front-end outlay of cash, or does that continue on for the lifespan of the product?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, Thom. And one thing I always try to tell customers and partners and people we're working with as we help them kind of through this journey is, if you're doing software to a medical device or a kind of something that makes a decision about a patient or is accepting very clinically critical data about a patient, you're not in the business of developing software anymore. You're in the business of developing regulated software. And there's many great reasons why there are these regulations. The FDA does not do stuff, doesn't pull ideas out of a hat. There have been very, very intense studies that started in the 90s about why medical devices fail. They found that a good portion of them fail as a result of software, and then they started creating software verification and validation, and now software assurance regulations to help and say, here's a way to prevent these horrific safety issues from presenting. Because as you develop software for medical applications, you're thinking of the patient first, and can you create a piece of software that is serving the patient, meets their expectations, exceeds their expectation, also prevents any unneeded or any kind of complication, adverse events as resulting from the device. So I'll start by saying that the first part, will always be some regulatory requirements that I'd say are not really something you can reduce, because you need to do clinical validation, you need to file that, you need to have formalized trials. Even though the FDA is doing amazing stuff coming out this year on how can you, for low-risk medical devices, how can you as an organization get pre-certified to reduce your overall costs, and then to launch medical devices with FDA notification and not approval, and no substantial external clinical validation, which I think is going to really change the cost structure. But why is it expensive? It's expensive because there's significant kind of quality overhead beyond the regulatory overhead of creating all the needed dossiers and clinical validations. You also need to create a regulated or a quality management system to manage all your processes and all your software, and people are finding that to be very, very expensive. Folks talk about numbers like 50% or 80% of my development cost happens because I'm doing regulated development compared to unregulated development. And I think one of the core issues there is there just not been enough development tools dedicated to solving that issue of the quality overhead, and how can you repeatedly create high quality software that meets and exceeds patient expectations. So I think that's how we're seeing the problem is, there is a certain overhead that will always happen, in the same way that, a biopharmaceutical plant has lower OEE than a chemical plant. But we think that in software, there should be a tool ecosystem that helps reduce that cost into an applicable manner, into somewhere that is not tech costs, because it's always going to be more expensive to make something that is making a clinical decision about a patient at the end, but basically ways to streamline that to reduce the overall cost structure.
Maybe we can push this one just a little bit further for the entrepreneurs in the audience, and I think maybe I'd be looking mostly at John and Erez. Deepu, feel free to chime in as well. But if you're an entrepreneur in digital health, are there certain areas where you would suggest you could have some cost savings here, and that would be advantageous? And there's other areas where you really don't want to cut corners, you don't want to cut costs, and you should expect to fund those needs.
I don't know if John, if you want to start with this, and I'll follow you.
Yeah, again, I think it's more a matter with that sort of thing of trying to think iteratively, trying to find out where maybe you do want to build up to a very high security application that's going to be highly regulated, but you also need to be able to build something workable in the short term as well. And I think one of the problems can be is if you think, oh, well, we need to be all the way at Z here, which is going to be a highly regulated piece of software. And that's how we need to start thinking about when we're at point A. One of the big problems with software development, in good software development often, is that it's iterative. You learn as you go. So you don't actually know what your end product is going to look like and how it's exactly going to be structured. So it creates this sort of impossible barrier almost where you have to decide what you have to see the future and plan for all kinds of things that can be very overwhelming and very expensive. So one of the pieces of advice is you can still have your long-term goals, but you need to figure out ways to have short steps. And when you can, to make them non-regulated as well, to go in those non-regulated spaces as well, so that you can move forward and actually build things.
Sorry, Erez, go ahead. Well, I was just going to tag on from a clinical perspective, it's exactly what John said. It's an iterative process. Even when you see a patient, most of the time you are putting together pieces of information and saying, 80%, this is what I think you have, right? And medicine, much like software development and the regulatory world, needs to evolve with whatever problem is in front of you. And so it will always be an iterative process. And one last point is, it's very important to involve the providers and the clinicians. So the people who are actually going to be using this technology, involve them early in the process so that you're not running into issues around, user experience or the various other issues that may come up. Erez, sorry.
Yeah, that's, both Deepu and John, those are great kind of points about this. And I would say that I think healthcare more than any industry needs to start by focusing on the patients, or on the user, whether that's a clinician or a patient. Start thinking, is what I'm doing right now, with all the extra costs associated with it, being medical, is that something I have to have? And is it something that is actually creating value for a patient or a clinician in the point of care? So first of all, just focusing, I think, helps reduce costs. The second thing is understanding that the medical world and the quality assurance world particularly has been historically focused on hardware quality, and that is still ingrained into the people you could hire, the processes that exist, and how people look at things. So I think taking a step back from that and reading the regulations, which are actually not extremely binding and are not hardware specific usually, except when they have to do with the kind of cleaning and sterilization, and just thinking, how can we apply them in a more effective way? This third thing I would say is to start thinking of quality. If you're going down a regulated space, you should start thinking of quality from day one. And how do I create a quality system that is beneficial for software development practices and gets ready for kind of the step after commercialization, which is post-market commercialization, and how do I deal with all the issues emerging from that? And I think that's the real story. Like, if you ingrain these things in what you do everywhere and understand that there is a way to develop best practices in software development, and not say, I want to just focus on algorithms and software, I don't want to think about quality, it's kind of a side topic, I think companies would do better in the long run.
Just to highlight your point there, Erez, too, about the idea of quality software development and how it's important to take that in consideration, because one of the challenges there is if you are trying to apply regulations and you do so in a way that basically is dictated to your developers, for example, and there's not a shared sense of responsibility there, that can also create a lot of difficulties where the regulations or whatever it is that you're trying to meet become more of a rubber stamp and something that, say, your developers are annoyed by rather than working to support. And when you get into that level of annoyance of the regulations and so forth, they also start to become, they're not minded. It's in software development, you have the idea of unit tests and things like that. And there's a very common pattern in software development where the tests actually aren't useful. And so everybody just starts ignoring them. And so you're actually worse off at that point because you're not even paying attention. The tests become a nuisance. If you're at this point where the regulations are a nuisance, as opposed to having this sense of shared responsibility for what those regulations mean and what you're trying to accomplish as the software is being developed, then you're already heading off in a rather difficult direction where you've got your own software developers may be working against what the spirit of the regulations are.
Yeah, and I think, John, just to follow up on that, and maybe you can extend on this as well, is the thought for management to kind of set expectations correctly for these type of regulated software development enterprises. Because there's a lot of companies who hire people, say, we're developing a game digital therapeutic. We should hire people who worked in casino gaming, which is an industry that probably runs, you know, kind of online casino gaming is almost as fast as you can release software. This is their mentality. And companies that do that have talked about how it doesn't work out at the end, because the folks developing online casino games that want to move extremely fast and break as much as possible don't really fit into this type of more structured regulated development and aren't successful.
And that's not to say they couldn't. It's also just a matter of making sure your team is on the same page, where in terms of agreeing what is important, whether that's your business unit, your managers. The general idea of like a highly functioning, successful, agile team is everybody is kind of contributing equally and everybody is sharing the same goal and the same responsibility about this. So it's not like you have, say, security people sitting outside of the development team telling them what to do or not do and sitting in judgment upon them, or even the regulatory people. It's a matter of creating this environment where you feel like you're working together. Now, that might mean some of your people come from different backgrounds, be it casino gambling or what have you, which is totally fine. But if you just allow them to sort of work kind of in isolation and throw things over the fence to them and then say, oh yeah, by the way, you need to be regulated or whatever. And they're like, yeah, fine, whatever. We have our way of working. Then that can create all kinds of problems and slow down the work as well.
I think we're actually starting to circle around our next topic here, which is certifications and regulations in digital health. So if we broaden our vision to the life sciences industry and we say we've got biopharma, diagnostics, and med tech as sort of big buckets to consider, these are highly regulated industries that entrepreneurs can plan for. I know what I need to do. I know what my trials should look like. As digital health starts to mature, I think that's where we see some new certifications and requirements coming around. But the question is, are these certifications and regulations, are they actually creating for better medical software? John, really interested in your thoughts and your experiences with that.
Well, so this could be a loaded answer. I'll first want to say, Ara's already pointed out all the really good benefits in terms of what the FDA has been doing. There are unquestionable benefits to working towards regulations, to making sure you're in compliance with things like HIPAA. But I will say also, that doesn't mean that you're developing good software or even secure software. Just because you're following those regulations, that has, and even the high trust evaluators will tell you this, because there are stories of companies that were high trust compliant that had security violations or had security breaches. So certainly none of these things are a guarantee on one hand, and then on the other hand, they can be a bit misleading, because you can say, well, we're following the regulations, we're high trust certified, or we're HIPAA certified, so that means we're okay. That means we don't need to worry. And those things, again, they're not bad. I won't say that at all. I don't want to give that impression, but they're not sufficient to mean that your software is secure. They're not also sufficient to mean that you have good software. So that's another part. We've already alluded to kind of the process of trying to make sure you have an interdisciplinary team, trying to make sure you have shared responsibility, and that you don't have this sort of situation where you have one group telling another group what they can or can't do, and that other group being resentful. And that can, again, create problems. I think another challenge, again, Erez also alluded to this as well, is that a lot of the regulations that are previous in place dealt with hardware. Technology was hardware. And the more advanced was like, well, it's software, but it's software running on-premise hardware. And things moved slower then. And also not just the hardware moved slower. Right now in the cloud, you have infrastructure that if you're doing things right, you might be using infrastructure as code with tools like Terraform and spinning up infrastructure and destroying it left, right, and center so that your actual cloud infrastructure becomes just as movable as software does as well. So these kinds of environments don't hold so well if you try to treat them as physical objects or physical hardware. So and again, Erez mentioned this, that there's movement to try to catch up there and try to sort of figure out, well, how can you have regulations when you have what software development is a very fast-paced sort of thing, and in fact, healthy software is iterated on. If you want healthy software, you have to continuously be developing it. You can't just like develop it and say, okay, we're done, as if it's a piece of hardware or if it's like furniture that you've built. You have to continuously maintain and work on it. And you need to develop this kind of culture of that as well. And sometimes the regulations can sort of work against that to some extent too. For example, like if you're doing FDA approved software, you can't change the image. You can't change the exact code without a whole lot of other like reviews and so forth. So it can lead to a lot of reluctance of updating your code, even if that's more beneficial to the patient. So again, there's a lot of movement in this area that sounds very positive, particularly listening to the things that Erez says, but you can, at the ground level, some of these things certainly can run interference with the actual development of your software.
And so if we move back to, and I think it's an important highlight of focusing on the genesis of digital health is to deliver better patient outcomes, provide payers and providers with better, more actionable data information, care for their patients better. It's not about coming up with a new toy. It's really about focusing on the patient and how do we improve lives here. Sometimes that can get lost, and I think one of the hindrances to new digital technologies being adopted are those patient outcomes. Again, when you look at a medical device or you look at biopharma, you're provided with, once you get regulated, with great outcome data. And sometimes with software as a medical device, we don't always have that data set to instigate adoption and prove that we make better patient outcomes occur. Deepu, as a healthcare provider yourself and as a clinician, how have you seen remote patient monitoring, for instance, and patient apps actually improve patient outcomes and improve the ability of providers to provide better care?
So I will say it's been a mixed bag, actually. The intent of these remote patient monitoring apps is well-meaning and has been well placed. The reluctance lies in the medical community and the clinicians, is that, can I truly rely on this data? And it's because in medicine, we're used to the gold standard of a randomized controlled trial, or a meta-analysis. That's the bar that we use to judge every single study. Now, it's not always possible because of the evolution of these apps. And as John and Erez have said, a lot of these apps, as wonderful as they are, don't always put the patient at the center, right? And so it's important to keep that at the center. And also the regulations that dictate the development of these apps are also fairly old. So we're building on an old foundation where we really, what we need to do is completely transform our current ecosystem so that we can use these the data developed by these apps or churned out by these apps to truly provide better clinical outcomes data, and so that clinicians can trust it. Because I don't know if a patient walks into my office right now and says, I walk 10,000 steps a day. What does that really mean? Right? That's a very simple example. So I think it's a mixed bag, but I do think both the developers and the companies who are developing remote patient monitoring apps and the clinicians are all well-meaning to make sure that we're providing the best information for patients. Because the other part is patients have their own information that they can look up, and that actually muddies the picture in terms of advising patients what we're doing, or what we're, it'll be like, for everything I say as a provider to a patient, the patient can provide me 3 other studies that are going to counteract what I'm advising, right? So while I guess the democratizing of information has been wonderful for both public health clinicians and availability for all this information. It does come with some complications around what is the best thing to do for a particular patient. And I think in that context, we have to expand our knowledge and our thinking of what does a trial, what does an outcome look like, and why is this important and that's where big data and all of these kinds of studies come in. And to Erez and John's point, the regulations will drive that, as will the iterative process of the development process.
And Deepu, I think moving sideways, and you bring up a great point here, is on one hand, it's fantastic that we're able to empower patients with better information and data on themselves. I think you can also very quickly jump the line to misinforming patients. For instance, it's one thing to have a genetic sequencing test done. It's another thing to interpret that test and understand, what does this really mean? It wasn't too long ago, I was meeting with a cardiologist, and he said, Thom, if I have another person who's healthy come in with their Apple Watch, who's telling them that they're having a cardiac event, I'm going to lose it. This is, going to add cost to the system. I have someone sitting in my emergency room saying I'm having a heart attack. The person is not. So actually, maybe John, if you could unpack a little bit of, what's the line between patient engagement and empowerment and really starting to misinform patients to their negative benefits?
Yeah, I think, Deepu already mentioned this as well in terms of the actual development, that if you involve your clinicians and your patients early on, then you can sort of catch some of this stuff and see it too before something that can happen with software, the way we can distribute it now in a way that can just go out to millions and millions of people with the push of a button. And then you can have all kinds of consequences that you didn't anticipate. So doing a lot of user testing, a lot of focus group type stuff would try to anticipate some of these sort of concerns as well, because again, we've done a fair amount of work too with cognitive testing, for example, and that's becoming more of a common thing where people might go online and test their memory and then freak out because they may have Alzheimer's, or maybe they actually do have a problem, but they're not being given proper information about what they might need to do about it. And again, it just becomes more of a nuanced responsibility, where I think if you take a very clear patient focus from the beginning as you start, before you roll out in large numbers and deal with it, that's certainly one thing that can help you. But you also have to always figure out, and people always say this, oh, please consult your doctor or whatever. They can always have this caveat language, which just sort of covers their backsides. But you need to do more than that to make sure that it's kind of an active response or an active providing of data or providing of information to interpret the data, so that you're not just saying the sort of general boilerplate language that by now most people probably ignore. You have to do something that's engaging in terms of how that participant can or should or shouldn't use this data, or not worry about certain things, or provide, be able to provide further resources for that. You can't just float it out there and then see what happens.
So maybe if we could drill down a little bit, and let's open it to the whole panel here. In that vein, are there specific areas within medicine that we think digital health is best positioned, and areas that maybe it should stay away from? So John, drawn on your background, we're seeing a lot of mental health startups come across the board and try to provide care, and even remote diagnostics that tell a person it's, you have this affliction or that. What areas would you suggest maybe investors and entrepreneurs maybe focus in first? And are there other areas where they should really stay away from? Is it oncology? Is it psychology? What would be the red lines and the green lines for people to stick to? We can open that up to everyone.
I'm not giving business advice. Gets a little bit tricky there. I mean,
I can sure.
Certainly, go ahead.
Or John, if you want to go.
No, Erez, please.
So just in general thoughts, I think one thing we forgot to mention, that we sometimes are talking about two different sets of regulations. One that has to do with protected health information, which is kind of the HIPAA compliance and making sure you don't disclose anything. And that's today in digital health, that's the table stakes. You have to be HIPAA compliant in general if you are dealing with protected health information, and if you actually want to do something with people and patients at the end. The second tier of regulation is these things about software as a medical device or other pieces of software that make decisions about patients or about life science processes. and they're actually significantly more regulated and have a lot of custom documentation and standards and validation procedures around what it is that your product does. So I think first of all, I think there's going to be more and more of a migration towards that side of the room of software that makes a decision about a patient. I think at many times it is going to be, starting with software that makes the obvious decision about a patient, because one of the big things healthcare innovators need to think about is one, helping improve patient outcome, and two, helping reduce physician and other healthcare practitioner workload. And you can do that by taking away tasks in particular fields of medicine that the decision in them is obvious, and almost any doctor would make the exact same decision given this input data. And I think looking into a field and saying, here's a few different pathologies that we know, if you get biomarker data on them, you could identify something in particular, and most doctors or all doctors or the literature says this is what you should do. I think those places are very interesting to pursue because they're very important and kind of the lowest hanging fruit in any field.
They are interesting. I think they always run a bit of a risk there in terms of the automated decision. Like this kind of sort of dilemma has been around for quite some time, where, for example, you could have an equation that predicts suicide, and it could predict suicide better than 90% of psychologists after an interview, for example. And yet, nobody's going to put that up there and make that like if you perform this test online, they're going to send the ambulance right out for you. For example, nobody's going to make like the decisive decision. They'll want that clinician human component in there. And so I feel like when you get into that non-human involved diagnosis piece, then it can get a little bit challenging as far as not just the regulatory piece, but some of the ethics of it in terms of leaving a human out of the loop in those situations.
Yeah, John, and I think there's a lot of instances of that where you shouldn't go as far, and that's part of the innovator's dilemma, I guess, here. But one interesting one, you can think of a first-line treatment in something like physical therapy, where you're injured in your elbow. I think the first-line treatment is almost always before imaging or diagnostics. You should go do physical therapy for 2 weeks.
Right.
Why would you even need to go to a physician to know that? If every physician you go to will tell you to go do physical therapy for 2 weeks first.
Yep.
That's the example I think about. But
that's a very good one too. Yeah.
Etho, I didn't know if you were going to jump in there.
No, I was agreeing with both of them. I agree with you. I think, you don't need to go to a physician to tell you to do rice, right? After but at the same time, I think a lot of the one aspect of care that comes into mind is referral services or prior authorizations for insurance companies or services, things like those things can be automated. And I think that is a huge component, things like billing and coding. All of those, I think, are as part of the network of healthcare and delivery of healthcare, I think would do both what Erez was saying, which is decrease the burden on clinicians and also offices, because we had a running joke at one of the practices that I would work at is the biggest corner office with all the windows belong to the billing and coding person. And that's really what drives a lot of these practices. And so if those are saying not to take away anybody's job, because you always do need a human component in healthcare. And I think the fear at least the fear before COVID, I think this is less so now. The fear before COVID with digital health and technologies was that they were going to replace the providers. And I don't think that that's ever, at least it shouldn't be, in my opinion, the intent of replacing providers, because providing human care requires a human being at some point in the care aspect of it. These are tools that help you make better informed decisions from a clinical perspective, not replace the human diagnostic component or the soft skills, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I have to say I couldn't agree with that more, Deepu. I think that we've had the experience here of having entrepreneurs come and say, I have this fantastic AI software, that's going to do what radiologists do now and today. And we say, well, what's the business plan? And they say, we'll use the AI to diagnose cancer and so on and so forth. Then you ask, well, who are the first adopters of that technology? And they say, well, radiologists.
Exactly.
And so the incentives to adopt really aren't there. And that's where I think too, and it'd be interesting to talk about this, we're at an inflection point of using digital technologies to enhance what providers have,
Exactly.
not displace what they're doing.
Exactly. And in fact, if you look farther downstream or upstream, whichever way you want to look at it, what we need to do is shift our mindset in educating the next generation on how these technologies are going to inform their decisions as they become clinicians from graduation onward, and then educate those clinicians who are already in their well established in their career so that they know how to harness, because you can't teach someone if they the next generation something if you don't have teachers in this generation to learn that. So there's, you have to tackle both ends of that stream.
One of the elements of regulated software that differs from traditional technology is post-market studies. I think if you look at a Facebook or a Twitter or a Salesforce, they're not doing post-market studies, of course, in the same way that we would consider it. Erez, what should software developers be thinking about with regard to post-market studies and framing them correctly?
Yeah, so I think with respect to post-market studies or post-market surveillance, which is about kind of being able to either launch a formal study on your product while it's in the market, or also very commonly be able to receive input, whether that is product complaints or adverse event from patients into your system, and then launch a corrective and preventative action, adjust your product, and so on. I think the things people need to think about is, one is, how agile am I in my software development practices to actually perform a change control and fix my product as a result of a complaint from the market. And I think John mentioned that earlier, that it is a very big issue. It's also a very big issue in medical device and in pharma. There's a reason that pharmacovigilance or medical device vigilance is, our industries on their own accord these days. And I think that'll slowly develop in regulated software. But when people are starting to set up and kind of plan towards the commercial phase and the approval of their product, and say, we do have a complaint handling process and we understand how to perform an investigation, I think they need to think much more deeper on how they perform the change control resulting in that investigation in a cost-effective way and in a way that does not overburden the organization. And I think that in the long run, we're going to see that companies are going to diverge into two categories: the companies who are developing regulated software in an agile manner and are doing it in-house and are able to constantly evolve and modify their software more like technology companies do. And the companies who won't be able to do that will be outcompeted eventually, as we see in the common kind of regular software market. If you can change fast, you can build better products. And if you can't, you can't.
Yeah, that's really well said, Erez. I think that you can have this compounding effect because of regulations, because of the types of software that you're trying to build. One of the real pitfalls that you want to try not to fall in as a software developer is not being able to admit you're wrong. Not being able to admit that you need to rewrite some things or redo some things. And in fact, that's one of the agile ideas. You're supposed to fail as quickly as possible. If you end up in a situation where you're not allowed to fail, you're not allowed to admit failure, you're not allowed to be able to restructure some of your code or re-architect what you've done, because it's all like some big enmeshed thing that you can't like rewrite. And you have to rewrite the whole thing because it was designed all at once instead of like in iterable pieces. Then you can end up in this place where you have a real hard time moving. So I think that advice is really well put in terms of being able to still be agile in this regulated environment and trying to think about it that way right from the beginning.
And so John and Deepo and Erez, maybe for those entrepreneurs that are now starting to hire software developers and starting to build out their teams, Erez, you brought up an interesting point of, if you're trying to come up with a gamified digital therapeutic, does it make sense to go to gaming developers and try to bring them in? They have some sort of background knowledge. But I think the question becomes, how do you turn a traditional software developer into a regulated developer? And are there some best practices for CEOs and management teams and developers themselves to be thinking about?
So maybe I can start this and hear what John and Deepu have to say. So first of all, I would say, if this is your problem, you should come talk to Ketrix. Erez at Ketrix.com. We will help you do this. That's what we're trying to do. I think, first of all, it's about setting the right expectations. There's a great talk by the CEO of Pear Therapeutics that talks about this issue and the hiring of the game developers and eventually the aerospace developers, which are more used to writing code in this way. But I think it's something that you need to set expectations with your workforce about how work is going to be done in this organization and the type of processes we need to uphold in order to serve patients in the best way possible. And then second, I think, is starting to ingrain all these processes, procedures, specification, documentation needs into your development practices and into your development platforms. And basically to try to remove as much of that overhead as you can to make people not be frustrated with being regulated developers, because there's not too many regulated developers out there that you can hire. Many of them work for the existing biopharmaceutical medical device industry. And if you want to hire people and train them for this, you need to set the right expectations with them and give them ways to do that is low friction, at a reduced cost for them personally, and in a way that continues to explain to them why all this extra work they're doing that they did not do in their previous job is important because it improves patient safety.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, John. That's right.
I was just, again, and well said. I think, yeah, if you can find good software developers, you want to hire them. So, I mean, for starters, if you can, but again, that's already a valuable commodity. Whatever their experience is or whatever their field is, if they're talented developers, then that's something already of immense value. And then it's a question of trying to be very upfront, so you're not setting expectations. You could hire some hotshot game developer and say, this is going to be exciting, we're going to change the way that we do cognitive therapy, and you're going to be able to change the world, and that can initially get them very excited and want to just jump in and start building stuff the way they're used to. And if you don't follow that up with, but we have to be careful, and this is going to be different than what you're used to, and we want to make sure that you're going to be okay operating in more of a regulated environment, as opposed to just selling them the sort of like really cool outcome without understanding that the path to that outcome is likely going to be quite different than what they're used to in terms of how they're used to working. But again, just to reiterate that other point of making it also working to not have that be an obstacle to them as much as possible, or have it be a stick that you beat them with in terms of like what they have to do or not do, so that also can be quite demoralizing. And again, it boils down to this idea of the team being on the same page about everybody agreeing, yes, we need to do this. Not just we have to do this, but understanding the importance of why it's done. Not just so that you're, crossing off a line or just like, making a check mark because that's what you have to do because of the regulations. If you can find ways to make sure that everybody understands the importance of it and values it, so that it's not just something that's tolerated, that also can be very beneficial.
I'll add a clinical lens to this. When I look to hire, I'm looking for attitude over skill, because it's really important. Skills are things you can teach, to whereas in John's point, they may not have developed this particular type of software or whatever it may be. You can teach that, but it's setting the right mindset and the frame of mind to allow them to take that and then run with it, so to speak. So, and also hiring outside of your industries, right? And I think Erez brought up the, did you say aerospace, Erez? I forget what you said. Yeah, hiring outside of it, because there are a lot of industries where processes will have overlap with what you're trying to accomplish, but you may not be aware of that. And so hiring people who are diverse, not only in diversity, the way we normally think of diversity in terms of nationality and culture and things like that, but also diversity of skill, diversity of industry. I think people will surprise you with what processes are in various industries that can be translated into whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish.
So we've seen, I would say, at Outcome Capital, when it comes to remote patient monitoring technologies and now remote therapeutic technologies, a bit of a bifurcation in the industry that I would analogize to maybe what we see in Apple and Android, in the sense that you have some companies that have sort of a walled garden where they have a dedicated software and device platform, and you have other companies taking the polar opposite view of, we want to work interoperably with all devices on the market and be kind of the middleware to enable that. But if someone prefers the Fitbit, they can use that. If they like a live core, they can use that. Another one saying, no, we only want to use our device. As the industry is maturing, who do we think is in what technologies and pathway is going to be most advantageous and is going to really win the day?
Are we all going to stake our necks on the line for that one?
Well, it's really going to depend on your application and what's necessary. Again, you want to have, if you can, you want to have the most coverage that you can out of the most devices. So if you can get away with a web-based application that can run on a smartphone, that can run on the web, then go for that. And if you can even start with that, before you need any kind of specialized things where you might need to have voice recognition or something like that, where you might want to have a dedicated application that runs on an iPad, say. So there's certainly, it can really depend on your needs, but the idea is like, you can be as general as possible. You can do an awful lot just on the web. And if you do that on the web, deployment, development, iteration, all of that is quite easy these days. And you're going to reach the most people that way, be they on smartphone or on their PC. So we've certainly taken that attack with some of the behavioral measures that we've developed as well. It's attractive to think of like, oh, we should just develop an iOS app, for example, or have something that runs on the iPad. But then you are limiting yourself to Apple's App Store and Apple's devices. And that's a certain subset of the market. And maybe that's the market you're targeting. Maybe you're targeting like an upper scale market that may only very likely use those devices and be happy with them. And that's fine too.
Yeah, I think it just depends on which ecosystem you want to be married to, or you can create your own ecosystem.
Yeah,
Completely disrupt the landscape, right?
Yeah, I think I'm a big proponent of the open standards, that if you're able to create a way to interoperate with your device or with your software, at the end of the line, both as an innovator, you'd be benefiting humanity better because you could reach more people maybe, but also, from a business standpoint, it's usually good to have this kind of ecosystem of other participants helping you build and helping apply your product. And I think one side of that, of a company that does have a dedicated hardware that announced last week of opening their data through an API is Dexcom. And you're starting to see that even companies that have dedicated hardware that is not interoperable by nature are trying to make it interoperable so other third parties can work with that data. And, that's my view, but maybe that's because I'm kind of an open source software geek, but we'll see how it happens.
And staying in the lane of sort of best practices and what people might forecast to see happening. Another instance that we've seen is a lot of young companies coming in with a question mark of, should I be thinking about using Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or cellular connectivity? Is one preferred over the other? Which technologies are appropriate? Which ones are more secure? That's certainly been a question that we've seen a lot of companies coming to us sort of pondering. So any thoughts there on pros and cons of the connectivity themselves?
I think that's going to really boil down to your applications and what are you doing with it. Again, you want to use whatever's easiest out of the box and whatever fits your needs. So again, I know if you can go Wi-Fi, that's generally, that's a much more well-known, easy to use standard. You have less trouble connecting, disconnecting, what have you. Bluetooth gets a little more complicated, oddly enough. You'd think that it would be all smoothed out by now. But at least last time I did some Bluetooth work, it was messy, a lot messier than I thought it would be. So again, I think that it really is, again, going to be very application specific. There's not really any gold answer. You do want to try, again, same thing with, where do you deploy? You want to try to hit, the easiest thing first, and make sure, if you are going to have specialized hardware that's going to be small, that then would, really make it much more amenable to Bluetooth as opposed to Wi-Fi, that you go for that.
We have a question coming in from the audience here. Typically, when patients and providers and the general public thinks about digital health and patient apps, they think about the commercial end of once it gets approved, how does it impact patient outcomes? But before you're approved, there typically is going to be some type of a clinical trial element that's going to have to occur. it would be interesting to glean everyone's thoughts on how do we see these patient apps changing clinical trials, typical clinical trials that we see today, and enhancing outcomes in that way with better data. Deepu, maybe you can kick us off there?
Yeah, actually, the short and simple answer is we don't even know what data we're going to be collecting in the future, right? There are someone we were talking a little bit earlier, and someone said, I didn't know when Twitter, the number of Twitter followers I have was going to be a metric of success for my for whatever project it was. You know, I forget how old Twitter is, but whatever it was invented, we didn't know. And so I do think that a lot of trials, or the way trials and study designs are going to change as we have more and more apps and remote patient monitoring. The health system kind of evolves around it, because you know, trials that worked in the 1950s, certainly not the way we do them now, you know, and how we deliver them. So how are we validating online information, online patient education material, wearable data, all data metrics, all of these things are going to change what, how, and when we, you know, what outcomes we're going to deliver to patients, because we don't know right now. It's very much a very fast evolving space.
Yeah, and I think maybe I couldn't have said it better, but the one thing I could add is the regulations that are coming out again this year, the AIML regulations, the software regulations, or guidances, I would say, are going to change some of that game as well. And we're going to look back at 2021 and say that it was, you know, what happened in 2020 with remote is a foundational shift, and what is happening in 2021 with respect to guidances is going to be a foundational shift, because people are going to move from, for low risk software as a medical device, to see that post-market clinical trials and real world evidence gathering is more important than kind of pre-hoc clinical studies. And I think that's going to shift that as well. And people are going to see that, wow, we were tracking the wrong biomarker or the wrong control as time goes on. And that's part of the adverse event processing and everything we talk about in post-market surveillance.
And goes back to the iterative process of, this is a learning process for all of us. And just to put a finer point on what Rez is saying, I think 2020, 2021 is going to be an inflection point for us in this area.
John, any concluding thoughts here?
No, this has just been very interesting. Again, I appreciate the insight of the other panelists. I think that it's a very exciting time, and that there are pitfalls as well too. I think that, you know, with these new technologies, we are going to be able to amass a wealth of data in ways that we haven't before. And while that's very exciting, it's so easy to do that we may not be capturing the data in the right way, and we may end up with a whole bunch of data that's not very interpretable if we're not careful. So there's a lot of like very exciting opportunities, but yet pitfalls ahead too.
We have we just had a bunch of questions come in from the audience, and I know we're running short on time here, so maybe we'll do one more here. When a patient submits his or her data to a healthcare provider via apps, who owns the data? The patient or the care provider at that point in time? And Deepu, I can see you smiling, so I imagine you have some thoughts here.
Yes, the answer is, did you read your end user agreement? that is the answer. You know, and that's actually a very hotly debated topic. Who owns the data? Right now, it can be, you can own part of it, but not all of it. It depends on how the data is sliced and cut. So eventually, you know, we'd like to see a more clear answer. HIPAA needs to evolve with what our technologies are offering now, and it hasn't quite yet. To Erez's point, I think Erez can probably speak to it a little bit better. But the short answer is we don't know, and it depends, which no one likes to hear, but it really does depend.
I could say that I could not speak to it better, Deepu, because I think an excellent summary of the there, which are also issues in the regular tech world, right, with all our data.
Yeah.
This has been a fantastic hour. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to everyone's questions here today, but I do think we are at halfway through the hour here. want to thank Deepu, Erez, and John for their time today. This has been a wonderful event. We look forward to having another panel event with Health Tech Build. And until then, we hope everyone stays well and stays healthy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.